Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to welcome our next speaker. His name is Dr. Perry Bell. Dr. Bell is a psychologist who works with not only children and adolescents, but entire families. So welcome, Dr. Bell.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So can you give us a
Sure.
little bit of your background as far as working and how you do your work?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a child and family psychologist, and one of my major focuses is parenting. I work with the Center for Child and Family Development, which is a group practice in Morristown, New Jersey. And really the foundation of our work is in social emotional learning and emotional intelligence, helping parents learn the skills of developing emotional intelligence in their children and helping children learn how to be emotionally intelligent within themselves. And that's important when you're dealing with any type of a clinical issue and then the other challenges of development that we all experience as parents, as children, um, because it helps us learn how to deal with life. And that's really the cornerstone of what we do.
So when you talk about emotional intelligence, what would that look like in, let's say, my younger child compared to an adult?
It's a great question. So as human beings, we're developing emotional intelligence, throughout time. So if you ask a 3-year-old, how do you feel? They're going to have a very different answer than if you ask a 33-year-old. If you ask a 33-year-old how they feel, they might say, well, I'm exhausted, I'm a little frustrated at my boss, and I'm having a really hard time figuring out my budget. And they might have all these thoughts and feelings tied in it, and it'll probably be a bit of a complicated, nuanced story of what their internal experience is. If you ask a 3-year-old, how do you feel? Usually you'll get, mad, sad, or happy. That'll be the extent of it, which actually will be pretty good from a 3-year-old. So what we know is that the more we have language to describe how we feel, the easier it is, or the more effective it is to understand our experience and then do something with our feelings. So part of helping a child be emotionally intelligent is helping them develop a language to describe their internal experience of the world.
So how, as a parent, am I knowing that I'm not telling my child what they're feeling and I'm wrong and instead of just equipping them to have the language?
Right. So how do we do that? So we first want to approach. Let's say a child is emotionally dysregulated, which is really to say, let's say they're not happy and they can't control themselves. The first thing we want to do with a child is to be validating. Very often one of the mishaps parents often make when children are in a bad emotional space is they'll start to rationalize or problem solve their child's experience. If a kid wants a cookie before dinner, they're crying and they're crying, you could tell them every nutritional reason why cookies before salad is a bad reason. They're not going to turn to you and say, what, mom, you're totally right. I'd much rather, have my protein and my vegetables before the cookie. You're making a great point. It's much better for me. That's not going to happen. The child is responding because they're frustrated and they're disappointed because what they wanted to get, they're not able to get, and they're upset about it. So we want to first validate the child's experience of the world. And in doing so, help them label their experience. Now, I think a lot of adults know nothing is more frustrating than somebody saying to you, what you feel. It's like, no, don't tell me what I'm feeling. I know how I feel.
Mhm.
Children are the same way. We want to help them label their experience. So, I see that, you can't have the cookie. And I can imagine that would be, disappointing. And then you want to define the feeling. It's disappointing because what you wanted to get, you couldn't get. And then you want to share, I felt the same way. You want to normalize the feeling. I've had the same experience. I totally get it. Not having a cookie is really, really tough. And this is a really hard experience for you. So you want to just stay with them in their feelings, be curious. I wonder if you're feeling X, or it sounds like you're feeling Y. And sitting with them in the feeling, helping them give a name to their feeling, And then from once you can validate the feeling and help them label the feeling and normalize the feeling, then you'll be in a position to transfer over into, well, I wonder how you can get the cookie. Well, I bet if you do a good job eating dinner, then I bet you'll be able to get it. So you're balancing, and this is something we talk a lot about, and I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but it's related. It's a matter of balancing feelings and then also providing limits, which is to say, a way in which you can get what you want in the world, because we can't just stay in an emotional world. But we also can't just say no cookies before dinner and leave it at that. That'll probably make the situation more challenging, not less.
Mhm, mhm. No, that's great. And I would want the cookie first, but I appreciate the the idea, how that flows because you're giving them words, you're asking them in effect if they're right, and then you're saying it's okay to feel that way. And you would think a 3-year-old wouldn't be able to articulate, but I'm sure they can as you do that more and more with practice, right?
Absolutely. And when we talk about practice, there's a few layers to that, and it's really important that it's an important point. Children mimic and model their parents and how they regulate their emotions. So if a parent is saying to their child, I could see you're feeling this way, and I wonder about this. And then when they're frustrated, they're, yelling and screaming, it's a bit of a conflicting message. So it's important that parents are able to model how they express their feelings as well. Oh, I'm really frustrated that we're in traffic. Yeah, it's really difficult. I really wish this wasn't the case. Okay, well, what can I do instead to make this better for myself? And with repetition, a child will see that and they'll learn that. And this could be a good time to mention, you know, when children have words to describe their feelings, we actually see that their tantrums start to go down. And that's because what if you think about what a tantrum is, of course they're emotionally overwhelmed. They don't know what to do with their feelings, but it's their expression of what's going on inside. Now, I don't mean that in sort of an abstract way. If they tantrum in such and such a way, it means it's frustration, and this way it's disappointment. What I mean is they're overwhelmed, they're upset, and they don't know how to tell you, Mom, I'm disappointed I can't have a cookie. But excuse me.
You-
Well, the more we find that children are able to say, Mom, I'm disappointed I can't have a cookie, the less need they have to tantrum because they have something to do in place of that behavior.
That makes a lot of sense. So then, like, I'm just thinking of the scenario of the grocery store. You're getting in line, you've got all your groceries ready to check out, and your child has decided that they didn't get something they wanted, or they're just done with shopping. And if they don't have the words, it's going to be a full blowout. But if they have words,
Absolutely.
maybe it'll be a little less.
Right, maybe it'll be a little less. And I think the same is true in all relationships, certainly for adults. When you're able to express what you're feeling and communicate it effectively, then you give somebody else the opportunity to respond effectively versus stewing your feelings and not doing anything with them.
Mhm. Now, you also do some work with moral intelligence too. How does that feed into the modeling and how we teach kids to have more awareness of their morals?
It's a great question. So I just want to briefly mention there's a really great book on this subject by Professor Robert Coles from Harvard. He writes a book. It's called um, "Developing Moral Intelligence in Children," and it's an important exploration into child's developmental differences in morality. As we progress through life, we start off a bit more egocentric, and we throughout life understand that we get more of what we want when we interact better with other people, and then eventually we understand that giving to others feels really, really good. And then sometimes when we give to others, we get a lot back in return. And so there's a whole progression that we go through in terms of understanding the world. And that's on one level. On another level, um, children, like we said, they model and they mirror what they see their parents doing. So parents can do a lot in terms of developing character, in terms of showing them how they think about other people and how they do for other people. So that's an important aspect here. Character development and emotional intelligence is very much related. If you develop with a child a sense of the world that includes character, that includes thinking about why we do things and the meaning and purpose why we do things. Meaning, we're good people because we like helping others, and that's good for society, and that makes us feel good about ourselves. It gives you a goal to direct your behavior. So if you think about two children, one who's deliberately taught, you know, we always want to make sure that we're being kind to others as a value, as a moral. And you think about a family where that's not something that's talked about in the same deliberate way. When both of those children get into an argument on the playground, as all kids are going to do, multiple times over, um, the kid in the group where they're being taught the end goal is we're making a connection, we are figuring this out together, and we're on the same team, is going to approach the situation differently than a child who doesn't have that end goal in sight. Now, of course, it's also related to emotional intelligence, because you can have all the best values in the world and all the best moral and character goals in the world. But if you're unable to take a deep breath, label your feelings, and do something with them, you're not going to be able to follow through on the goal. So they're very much related in that way.
Do you think they also pay attention to just what you do as a parent and what you say versus what you do?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In many ways, children are more likely to mimic what they see than what you say often. I think about growing up for myself. My mom was always bringing food to the local food pantry. That was just a part. I just knew that was something that she did. She didn't have to say it. I just knew this is something that my mom does. My father is somebody who is always working with charities, and these are just things that were a part of my world growing up. Um, and as an adult, I became a child psychologist. And as much as we all want to think we're all making our own independent choices, and we are in some degree, I was certainly impacted by growing up in a home where I watched my parents give. That was a part of the fabric of my home, and I know that's a part of my being and a part of the direction that I went professionally, without question.
Mhm. Is it too late though? Let's say a parent realizes now, oh, I've not equipped my child emotionally or morally, and my child is 5 or 6, or maybe even older than that. Is it too late for them to help their child still develop that?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think at any point in time, whether it's the early childhood years, the adolescent years, or beyond, it's never too late. If we think about what develops a person's self-esteem, it feels good to be competent. Oftentimes, if somebody's experiencing a bout of depression or sadness, we help them do things to make them feel good about themselves, to complete a task, whether it's cleaning your room, helping somebody do something productive, just to make them feel like, oh, I can. And very often, the same is true in the moral context, which is to say, if a child is 5 or 6 and maybe they haven't thought about these ideas, had certain experiences, showing them that they're capable of helping somebody else deliberately. I'll come back to like to the food kitchen example, and I've actually seen this play out in many families. When children actually are engaged in some of these things and they see they can make somebody else feel good in a positive way, that's very reinforcing to how they feel about themselves and the identity that they develop ultimately.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Do you think it has to be outside of the family that they're helping too? Because I'm thinking if a parent told their child, go help your brother, it's probably a different feeling to that child than go help the neighbor down the street who really needs your help.
That's a great question. And for some reason, the people who are closest to us, sometimes we don't put that effort into or thought into. Um, Specifically our siblings. And that's because our siblings, that's a very different type of a relationship. I'm not putting a judgment on it. I certainly, there's nobody I terrorize more than my little brother growing up. But it went both ways. We're very close. But your love relationships, they have meaning attached to them. The love between a parent and child. It's one of the reasons why it's hard for you to be rational with your children. It's hard for your children to just see everything their parents are saying as surface level. There's always a meaning attached to it because it's a different type of a relationship. So what you're saying is even more important, really, which is how do we how do we hold on to those feelings and then do the right thing in those contexts,
Mhm.
which is an important conversation, and we all can relate to that tension of, let's say, wanting to be respectful to a parent and also feeling frustration at your parent. That's a feeling we all can relate to, for on whatever level. So how do you manage those two things? And I think that's kind of what you're bringing up, is what's this intersection between the moral choices that we want to make and the emotional, um, and the feelings that we're holding on to simultaneously.
Mhm. I think if I were a child that was struggling, and part of my struggle was competition with my sibling or competition with one of my best friends that I've known, as long as I can remember, it would be easier to learn some of that emotional control away from them and then go back and try to put it back into play. Well, this is very complex stuff, but you're explaining it in ways that I think we can really hold on to. So, really, if we wrap it up, if you were to give parents just like a couple pieces of advice as far as how to get started on being more intentional, what would you say those couple pieces would be?
Okay, so I think that to begin our conversation today, we spoke about labeling feelings, and I think that we want to start off in a very rudimentary way. We just want to understand where our thoughts and feelings are coming from. So we think about the brain. There are two major systems that I just want to mention, and then I'll talk about why just briefly. You have in the center of your brain a series of structures that make up the limbic system, which are your emotional centers. That's where your feelings come from. And a lot of kids who have big feelings have big emotion centers. They have big limbic systems. So with kids, we call that the feelings brain. I want to contrast that with the front part of the brain, which is your prefrontal cortex. That's where your rationality, your logic, your problem solving, decision making, that's where that comes from. With kids, I call that the thinking brain. It happens to be that children develop their emotion brain a lot more, it's a lot more developed than their thinking brain until they hit about their mid 20s. So people are making, and girls before boys. But which I think we all see. I mean, I think it's an important point because your emotion brain has a head start, and it can be, and for some kids it's powerful to begin with. So what happens often is when the emotion brain is triggered by disappointment about not getting a cookie, frustration at your brother or sister, it tends to hijack or take over your thinking brain. So in these moments, children are literally not capable of being rational and logical. And I see a lot of parents, the first mistake they make is trying to be rational and logical with a little brain that literally doesn't have the capacity in that moment. So a little tip would be to help children label when they're thinking brained or when they're emotion brained. And for parents also, even before that, to stop and pause when their kid is emoting and to ask themselves, is my kid emotion brained or thinking brained right now?
Mm.
Because if we can label that they're emotion brain, now we know we have to speak the language of emotion. We should pause if we're going to jump into just being rational.
Mm. That's yeah. Yeah. So if you were to do that, let's say just a brief example of what that would look like if you were to address their emotion brain.
Sure. So keep coming back to this cookie example. So sweetheart, I see that right now your emotion brain is really upset. I wonder even if your emotion brain is disappointed that you can't have cookie before dinner. And I get it. I would feel the same way. It's really hard. My emotion brain would feel the same way. In fact, it does sometimes. And that's hard. So when your emotion brain is ready and calm and a little bit calmer, I'd like to talk to your thinking brain about when you can have a cookie.
Ah,
And
I
then you
see.
want to help them learn to self-soothe and to regulate. And then when they're ready, oh, mom, my thinking brain is back. Oh, I see your thinking brain is back. All right, so okay, let's talk about this a little bit. And I think it also helps parents a lot develop a sense of mindfulness and self-awareness about how they're being deliberate in their parenting. Because if you think about it, if the kid's brain is emotionally hijacked and the parent's brain is emotionally hijacked, the outcome usually isn't so positive. Usually that spirals out of control. We start off with a cookie, but we end up with you're grounded till college, and that's not what we're looking for. So you have a much better shot if you're staying rational brained, and then we can label the emotion brain and hopefully switch them also into their rational brain. And that's the language that we want to develop just within the home in general.
That's perfect. Well, Dr. Bell, this has been super informative. I love how you've made it so simple to understand too. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your knowledge.
So
And if you're all right,
thank you for having me.
Oh, 100%, 100%. If you're all right, we'll bring you back in a little bit.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye-bye.